This episode of Fantastic People is sponsored by Advanced Tree and Property Services of Northwest Florida. They do everything from tree trimming and removal, stump grinding, debris hauling, tractor services, various mulching services. So if you're in need of any of those services, give them a call at 850-356-0315. Again, that's 850-356-0315. You can also email the owner at jamesd.cole22@yahoo.com. That's JAMESD.COLE22@yahoo.com. And like I said, you can also search for them on Facebook. You can like their page, send them a message on Facebook. They're actually really responsive that way as well.
Welcome back to Fantastic People. I'm your host, Christian.
And I'm Regan, and here with us today is a very special guest, all the way from East Amherst, New York, former graduate of Shenandoah Conservatory of Music and former chorus and music teacher. With us today is Miss Angela Hayes.
Hello.
Yes, Angela, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
I think an important distinction is she was your music teacher.
That is an important distinction. Yeah,
I was. Yes.
Yeah.
At my time, I was, and this is the funny part of it. When I first met Regan, I was definitely like a true New Englander, born and raised in Connecticut. This most southern place I had ever really spent substantial time was at Shenandoah Conservatory, which is in Northern Virginia, just outside of DC. And then I ended up taking the dive into what we call the Deep South, which was Pensacola, Florida. And that's where Regan and I met in the early 2000s.
Yeah, and it's pretty close to Deep South.
Yeah, it's the
South
I
Alabama,
would say
really.
it's really, yeah, like you have to understand, for New England people, like anything north of the Mason-Dixon line is like south. So when you say Florida, Alabama South, they're like, oh, Deep South.
Yeah.
That's what we call it.
My wife is from Connecticut, and she's been here.
Excellent. What part?
Waterbury.
Oh my, that's actually close to where I grew up. Like yes. Yeah, I know Waterbury. Like Waterbury was a stone throw away. I used to go to the Waterbury Mall.
That's awesome.
So, and Connecticut's a small state, but Waterbury was probably 30 minutes from where I grew up.
That's very cool. She definitely, she's been here like 15 years and still, especially, maybe not her so much, but my in-laws still very much, there are things where they're like, they just don't get it. And I'm like, it's just a Southern thing.
Yeah.
We say 8,
Yep,
you know, like,
we do. It's in the
just way
dictionary.
it is.
I love that though. I love the marriages between the North and the South. I just think it's really cute to watch, because you end up saying that sometimes, like, oh, that's just a Northern thing. Oh, that's just a Southern thing.
She's a Yankee. She can't
because
help it.
it is.
Yeah.
Can't help it. That's how we are.
So we're not here to talk about that today, which
No.
what we are here to talk about is the thing that you love, and that is, what is it? Go ahead and tell us what that is.
Yeah, one of the things I think that has been, a near lifetime love has been my love for jazz music and the standards.
So if you could tell people who are maybe unfamiliar, how would you define the standards, or even jazz music?
First of all, I love that you said, how do you define the standards? Because I think that it's different than jazz, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think jazz has, I feel like jazz is very diverse stylistically. And I think that when you talk about the standards, you're talking very specifically about, to me, the standards is the love songs of jazz, that we go back to again and again and again. Nobody would think about saying that they love the standards without having a list that you can find in, you know, all the real books and just about any jazz musician's repertoire. They have the standards. So I think the standards are the greatest love songs probably ever written, and I mean that even to this day.
No, and that's true. I mean, I think from my little bit of exposure, you know, being in your class and just following you over the years,
Hmm.
they are timeless. They really are. Um,
Yeah.
as a style and as the lyrics. I mean, they relate
Yep.
cross generation, and you see these artists that emerge that do their piece of the, you know, their chunk of the standards on their album, and it's the same song, but it's different, and it
Yep.
still gives that same emotion and meaning that it did when it was first created.
Yeah, it is very generational. I would say over the last probably 30 or 40 years, or in the increase in pop music, we kind of still always had a person to represent or rep the standards.
I love that though.
Oh,
I think that over the past, and I'll ask you this as an instrumentalist, do you feel that while there's been representation of the standards over the past 20 or 30 years, do you think that it is faltering um, at this moment in time?
that's a great question.
Hmm.
Yes and no. I think both are
Yeah.
true. I think there is something to be said for individualism. So when you see new interpretations come along, that is a good thing. Now, and I may be in the minority here, but someone like, for example, maybe Michael Bublé, I'm not a huge fan of, because I
Right.
don't know that he's adding anything new to the genre. And so for me, like, it's almost too much of a blend between big band jazz and these standards and pop music, for me to like
Yes.
fall in love with it. But if you were to tell me, like, do I think the impact he has had, or Harry Connick Jr. has had on the mainstream exposing people to these things, I would say that's a great thing.
Yeah.
I think Bublé is an interesting guy to me because he actually is just a handful of years older than myself. So he came into our world of people to listen to in the jazz world, or standards world, let's say. I don't want to say jazz, I'll say standards world. I would say around the early 2000s, is late 90s, early 2000s, around that time is when his name was all the buzz.
Yep.
And I remember it because I think what was kind of weird about it was that in the late 90s, and you guys wouldn't remember this, but in the late 90s, it was a time where, gosh, like music had gotten, like if I listened to 90 songs today that were maybe top 40, the music had gotten really, at the time we'd sing
Yeah.
along, but now I reflect on it and I'm like, yikes,
Yeah.
turn that off. Like, it's like the lyrics were they were just very dirty. That's the only way that I could describe them. And I sit back now and I say, like, wow, like I can't believe that in our youth, like we were listening to this and not fully realizing what we were singing along to. So I think that what happened with Buble and Jane Monheit as well, she came along kind of in that same group of years. There was this resurgence of something that was more pure, right? And not that dirty, trying to cut, not trying to break barriers type of sound. And so I think that for someone like myself, I so much appreciate that there was a return of the standards at that time. Everybody, when I was getting married, it was jazz, jazz, jazz at the, like every
Yeah.
wedding, that's what you were listening to, or you're listening to the standards. Every engagement party, you were listening to the standards. And I think that Buble actually did have an important role in that. So I will always treasure him. But I understand what you're saying, where you feel that he has a lot of pop. I can't believe I'm going to say this publicly, but I'm going to say it. I I'm not really a fan of his original music.
No, completely agree there.
Yeah. It almost never goes. I mean, there's been a few that I can say, all right, that's fun. But as I listen,
Like it's
the more
fine.
and more I listen to it, the less and less I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
I'll skip that song on the album.
And I think that's kind of
A
boils
lot.
to my problem with Michael Bublé is like I don't feel like
Yeah.
there's a lot of originality there. So when he does
Yeah.
like the standards, I like it because I like that those songs are back in popularity and that people are listening to them,
Yes.
and the formula is already there. He just follows it
Right.
along. But when it's hey Michael, come up with something creative on your own, I'm like, oh, okay, this is you're not really adding anything new to the conversation here.
But I wonder, and not to make this whole thing about Bublé, but I mean, that's a lot to analyze. I wonder if during his time, where he really grew in popularity, pop was king. Pop is king.
Oh,
Pop
for sure.
continues to be
100%.
king.
Had to be.
100%.
And so,
Yeah.
in order to
Yep.
stay relevant with an audience that's below 45, he has to do pop. And so,
He has to.
but that
Yep.
doesn't work for him, in my opinion.
I
Pop
also
doesn't work.
think I'm going to throw this out there to you guys because something I don't know, like Reagan, you might know this about me. I don't know if I ever shared it with you guys when I was teaching. I have also always been like a major fan of David Foster and his production. And something through the years that I realized was Bublé. And if you ever go back, you might realize the same exact thing, is that the Michael Bublé that I loved, the early stuff that he did, that I felt was really true to the standards.
Yeah.
Now, Bublé is absolutely a vocalist. His voice is fantastic if you really listen to it. And I've heard him live. Like the guy can do his thing.
Yeah.
But I felt like his early stuff that I loved, and then there was a whole period of time where he was doing different things, and I was like, "That's not the Bublé I want to hear." David Foster was not involved in those kind of like midway albums, and Bublé did an album. His most recent one, his son had cancer, and he came back, and are people still going to want me? That sort of thing. And he did an album called Love.
Yep.
I kid you not.
Yep.
I actually cried when I heard some of these arrangements. And I was like, what the?
Yeah.
I said, this is the Bublé that I loved. Like the musical phrasing, the arrangements. He was so deep in it. And when I looked into the album more, David Foster was
I didn't realize
back on board.
I didn't realize that.
So I sometimes think that the Michael Bublé that I love, and that's the Michael Bublé that just went really hard on the standards, and I felt interpreted them beautifully. I sometimes wonder if that wasn't David Foster.
That's a great point. And that's the one. Love is the album with Georgia, isn't it? Or Georgia on My Mind, or whatever the song's called. I just
Love is the one that has oh my gosh, I can't remember every song on it. It might have Georgia on it.
I think it.
But I'm being honest, I can't remember off the top of my head.
That's okay.
But I found that interesting because I like how much their sound can change if the person producing is switched.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I don't know, and I got the interpretation that as an artist, he was trying to stay relevant maybe and do his own thing. And I feel like, buddy, I like David Foster's thing a little better, but I'm more of a purist, right? I prefer the standards to not stray too far. So I always feel like if somebody makes them too pop, that's a no for me. And I kind of shut down. I get very turned off by it.
I would say this, and we can move on from Michael Bublé. I just want to rectify. I do think his version of "Feeling Good" is outstanding.
Yeah, I mean,
fantastic.
You can't. That is one of my top 5, maybe 3 karaoke songs. Like,
oh, really?
Yeah, and it's his version that I do.
Yeah, it pumps me up.
Like that's my favorite karaoke.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about, we talked a lot about the standards, but you also mentioned jazz. And so for people who maybe are unfamiliar, could you give us a definition of jazz and what makes it different and its influences in our current music society?
Oh my gosh, that's a hard one. Our current music society. Well, I think that it's always been important when I think of jazz. I think that the most important thing for me, and when I would speak about it, I would always say that you have to understand that this genre was what we would equate with our pop music today, right? When it was all the rage. And so there was, as we see a natural evolution to our pop music, right? Like I have a daughter and she talks about, oh, that, that early, like 2000, 2007, 2008, because she was born 2007. They're so different. That music is so different than today. And I'm like, oh, really?
It
But
is, though. It really
pop
is.
music, it really is, though. And I think that it's important for us to, like, when you think about jazz, you can't think of it about like it's something, that is just like of the past. It was the pop music, I describe it as that, of the time that evolved. So when you dissect jazz, you can see the evolution. And I think that for me, I think that it's easier to hear the evolution if you're looking at instrumentalists. And that's just kind of my thoughts on it.
I 100%
I think,
agree with that. 100%.
yeah,
I like, for example, I big fan, Reagan, you talk about karaoke and feeling good.
Yeah.
For me, like as a percussionist, Caravan is like the pinnacle to me of like a drumming capability. Like that song is incredible. But if I were to compare that to, say, something like, I listen to a lot of, if people, shout out to people who listen to Japanese jazz music, a pianist named Hiromi. They're
yeah,
two different styles of music almost, but you can hear the
yes.
connection. Yeah. You can hear how one
But
came from the other. Go ahead.
that's the beauty of listening, right? Like when you're able to say, like, I know who that person listened to, like I can understand their influences. I think that is when you realize that you're dealing with like a real artist, where they're still being themselves, but they're being influenced. They're not copycatting.
Yeah, right.
And I think that with the evolution of jazz music, the one thing that I really do kind of like about it is that I feel like there weren't a lot of copycats. Like I think that people really defined their sound and then interpreted it. And I think that modern musicians can really learn from that if they kind of dig in, and again, I'm really talking more instrumental. If you just kind of go through the decades with it.
Well, and but what I'm hearing anyway is that it's easy it's one thing to sing a standard or to play a standard. It's another to make it your own. I
Yeah.
feel like, I can't.
I think I know of an example of what you're talking about. When John Mayer was doing the John Mayer Trio and he was playing jazz and blues music, he would go into a solo, and I saw an interview with him, and he would play a lick, and he'd say mentally, I'm like, oh yeah, John, that's real cool. And then he'd be like, it's cool because it was B.B. King, 1963.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's John Mayer.
Yeah. He just, he has this encyclopedia of music in his brain. And so he's playing this thing, and he's able to take these moments from music past and insert them in new places and highlight. And for him, he means it as kind of like a negative because it takes away from his own originality, and he feels bad about it. But as a fan of music, kind of to what we've been just saying here in a minute, like it's both honoring and enhancing at the same time.
Because he probably does put his own spin on it.
Yeah.
And John Mayer, like he's another Connecticut guy of my age, so I'm all over John Mayer because I followed him forever. He is deep into jazz studies. Like if you know John Mayer, like you realize that. And I think that there probably isn't a guitarist out there, like they may not admit it, just because he has his reputation personally, and whatever, that is what it is. But musically, I think that he is a talented guy, and I love that he's willing to dig into the theory a little bit sometimes.
Yes,
Some of his clips just on YouTube, I'm like, this is so wonderful for students to tap into what he's doing. And I agree with you where he's like, well, this isn't mine. But musicians are like, but you made it yours. And you weren't copying it. Like you took it, and that's called interpretation. And I think I think that he is an incredible musician. And I love him as a vocalist too. I think some people don't give him enough credit as a vocalist in the world of John Mayer. And John Mayer there are enough standards featuring John Mayer that are out there that I think would blow your mind. I mean, every time I come across one, I'm just like, really, John, can you do an album?
Just do one of these, please.
Just do one of these, just you singing. I heard actually not that long ago, I heard a duet that he did with Tony Bennett, and it was oh my goodness, I can't remember the name of the song right now, but it might be the only one that they ever did together. But it's the song where they're supposed to be like at a bar and they're singing about like, kind of their hard luck with women.
Mhm.
But the give and take that he had vocally, I was like, man, like people just wouldn't expect that. And so while John is a great guitarist, and I do think he is, um, if you're a guitarist and you hate me for saying that, whatever. But I think he's a great guitarist, but I love him as a vocalist too. And it's because of his timbre and his phrasing. It's very unique. And when he's doing the standards, I believe that John Mayer went to Berkeley for a while. I think he may
Yeah,
have
that's
dropped
correct.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that's true. But you hear that, and people that are musicians, they love to tap in, and you can hear the difference. He's not mimicking anybody at all.
Yeah, for sure. So tell us, to transition just a little bit, when
Yeah,
did you first experience jazz music or the standards, either one?
this is really funny. Um, I think that it's the sort of thing that when I was growing up, it was the pop music of my grandparents.
Mhm.
So I think that it would casually be, played on the television or the radio, and it would just kind of be in the background, but I never took serious note of
Mhm.
it, right? It would just be one of those things as a kid growing up. And I think that the first time that I heard it and recognized it for what it was literally like a love in first sight or a love at
Mhm.
first sound type
Mhm.
of moment. I remember it to this day. I was a little helper in my music classroom in high school. And one of my jobs, I think maybe I was a sophomore, maybe. And my job was to clean out the music library. And at that time, the music library that I was kind of in charge of cleaning out and organizing was records, tapes, like all the old forms of music, right? Like we did not have, we didn't stream anything.
Mhm.
So it literally was like pull it out of the sleeve type of thing, or. And I was going through all what we considered were old records. And I was going through the old records and I came across an album of Lena Horne. And I put it in, and the first song that I played was of Lena Horne's, and it was called Nice Work If You Can Get It. So it was holding hands at midnight. Da, 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 dum, da, 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 dum, ba, 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 da, dum. I don't remember the words, still don't, but I remember the melody to this day because it has such an impact on me. And I
Mhm.
remember just saying, like, what is this? I listened to that song again and again and again and again and again. And then I was like, what style of music is this? And then I just wanted to
Mhm.
learn. And we didn't have, at that time, this was before, Google and all of that. And
Mhm.
so like you had to dig for
Right.
information. It was right,
Had to
we
go to
were
a
right on the
library.
cusp. We were on the cusp of explosion, right? So like 2 or 3 years
Right.
later, boom,
Internet.
like that's when it exploded, but this was right
Mm.
before. And so I had to work to figure out who she
Mm.
was, and I had to work to figure out what that genre was. And to this day, like I remember I just remember that line.
Mm.
And I just remember just falling in love with it, and I never fell out of love. And the more that I dug into that genre, I have always felt like I just connected more deeply to that genre. I love all music, but I have a special connection to that. And that was my first experience. And I never fell out of love with it. I never got bored with it.
That's awesome. That is very
Hmm.
clear today. It was very clear over, oh gosh, was it now 13 years ago, 14 years ago,
Yeah. Yeah.
in class. You do, I mean, you embody that genre of music, and that love really comes out. But what I thought was really incredible today, um, when we do the show, we try to prepare by experiencing the thing.
Exposing
Yeah,
ourselves. Yeah.
exposing ourselves to the thing that the
Yeah.
guest is a fan of. Sometimes it goes all right, sometimes not so much.
Not
but,
so much.
but we try because
That's nice.
that's what we want to do. We want to highlight different things that people love, and I think it's worth experiencing those things and our listeners experiencing those things. So first of all, everybody listening, I hope that you do go out and you check out these names that we're talking about. You do
Please
check
do.
out this music because it is incredible stuff. But what was really kind of took me away this afternoon when I got ready to prepare, I was like, all right, I don't know how I missed this. I'm sure you dropped Lena Horne's name back in the day, but I never went out and found any of her music.
Terrible student.
Yeah, exactly. So I did. I was like, okay, I know that I didn't.
Shame on you. I know I said it.
Oh, definitely. I know that I didn't do it. I was like, I feel bad. I need to do this. So I was like, I'm going to start. I'm not going to just put on like jazz on Spotify. I'm going to actually like
look up the artist.
I'm going to go look up the artist.
You're going to dig.
So I
You're
did
gonna
that.
dig.
And the first thing, I guess their first album was, or at least the first one that Spotify gave me, was the Stormy Weather album. And Tomorrow Mountain, the very first song, I hit play.
Yep.
And I mean, without question, I was like, wow, that's Angela Hayes. Like I heard
You heard
I heard her through you through her because of how much she inspired your life. When you sing, when you talk, when the types of performance that you draw out of your students is very similar to what I heard on that very first song.
That's awesome.
So I think that's amazing.
Regan, like that actually, that touches me deeply because it's funny how some of those influences that are literally the root of how you develop. It's amazing how far-reaching that can be.
For sure.
Right? And for you to hear it and say, "Oh my gosh, like I hear that influence." All I can say is like, you should, because it was that deep of a soul connection to it. I remember thinking at that young age, I get this lady, right?
Right.
And there are certain musicians, and I don't know if you know this about me or not. I have met, I had this weird thing where I would meet these musicians in the most like jazz people in real unusual ways. And there are some that you just like, you're like, these are my people, right? Like you, and you feel the connection through the music and from when they play, and then you speak to them and you're like, we just get each other. So it's a beautiful thing. And of course, like I never met Shirley Horn, but, or Lena Horne rather. Shirley Horn I did meet, but not Lena Horne. But that's one of those things where you just are like, man, that like the spirit behind what she was singing, she told her story. And I do feel it, like for everything that it's worth, I have yet to find a genre that I feel just like digs so deep into the listener's soul. And I do try to find it. Like I listen. Some people have said, well, maybe country music comes close. Country music can write a ballad. And I'm not a fan of country. But there are other songs that maybe, not modern country, right?
Right.
But if you listen to some of the older things, I'm like, you listen to something, it's not a love song, but you listen to something that's like Ring of Fire. My gosh, like that guy was singing from his heart. Like that, that was, but you know what I'm saying?
Right.
So I think that today, maybe a way for musicians and listeners to connect, before they try to make it their own, understand where it came from. And I think that that's really kind of, that is something that I can't stress enough, is thinking about what inspired you and why.
Yeah, you're speaking my language right now. I often tell people, both actually with jazz music and with like classic country, to just give it a shot. And before you try it out, like do a little bit of research.
Yep.
Like I just understand, like especially with like classic country, I think it's important to understand that Waylon Jennings, Johnny Cash, Elvis Presley, these guys were the rock and roll stars of their time. They lived
Elvis Presley.
They lived very hard lives, and that comes out in their music.
100%.
And that's important to understand. And I think with jazz, and I am, again, we've talked about, I'm an instrumentalist. I traditionally listen to more music without vocals than I do with.
Yes.
If you take the time and just can you don't have to take a music theory class or anything like that. Just understand for a musician what it's like to try to understand we're switching between keys and time signatures and the mental fortitude it takes to get through this and try to develop a little bit of an appreciation. The music will do the rest. Again, I use the song Caravan. That from a drumming perspective, that's an incredibly difficult song. And so if you look at
Yes.
the people who have attempted to play it, if you try to maybe take a classic name like Buddy Rich, I think no matter who you are, you can watch Buddy Rich play, whether you know anything about drumming or not, and appreciate what that guy did. I don't know if that exists in music today. Maybe I'm just an old soul at heart or crotchety about modern music, but for me, that is such an important. Like we all could open up our musical appreciation if we just gave it a shot. We just open to it.
Yeah, well, that's so.
And we have to learn,
Yes,
right? Like
absolutely.
I think a lot of younger musicians that like I might talk to a little bit, or listen to and see what they're doing. Sometimes I feel like maybe like I remember always wanting, and still even in my life now, like I am always excited to learn more and to expose myself to new interpretations and what can I learn from this. And I feel like there's not that spirit of learning, and learning is reflecting on the past and pushing yourself forward. And I think musically, sometimes I wish I heard more of the reflection, because if you're pushing from where you started from, you haven't built a base.
I think a good example of that, both like John Mayer, like we were talking about earlier, but another one in pop music is Lady Gaga.
Yep.
She's a very talented jazz musician.
She is.
And people may not always know, but if you gave it a shot, and I think that's why she's so talented in pop music, it's because she has the training,
she has those roots,
the education, and the roots.
Yep.
She's an interesting artist to me because I love Gaga as a pop artist just because she's kind of weird and out there, and I'm like, but she always was. She was theatrical, but in a way that I always said, no, she has a lot more going on than just the show of it, right? Like, so that's just a part of her deal. But when she started really branching out and saying, like, I'm not just this mass produced item, I definitely took note. I think that when she well, obviously she did that album with Tony Bennett, which I'm actually so grateful for, because a whole generation that is exposure to the standards. I enjoy her interpretation very much.
Well, and I think
but I think for timbre, and I'm just being honest, like this is just my personal preferences. She almost has a sound to me that sometimes sounds like Barbra Streisand when she's doing the standards.
Yeah,
totally
and
agree.
I was never a fan of that sound in the standards, even though some people, that was the sound that they loved.
Yeah.
That wasn't I never gravitated towards it. But at the same time today, I have just so much respect for what she has done, and especially for the standards. I'm like, that is a whole generation of kids, young people. I don't want to say kids, but young people that would have never even bothered to listen. And now they fall in love with a song and dig deeper. And then somebody could be out there ready to give us be the next, the next new voice that we want to hear. And she may play a role in that, like, because they happened to hear her when they were young. And I think that is so valuable.
Do you think her connection to Barbra Streisand in style has led to A Star Is Born remake? Because they both played the same role.
I kind of do. I absolutely kind of do. I think that, see, that's the thing that's wild about her, because again, I thought she did a great job in that movie. I think she's a great artist overall. And I always feel like I don't like to say anything bad about Lady Gaga, because I think that she has contributed so much, especially to things that I love. But again, I think it's okay to say, like, I do see that Streisand, I hear it. And that's not necessarily, but I think that they're both so amazingly talented. So it's okay for me to say, like, they're wildly talented, but it doesn't pull on my heartstrings. in the way that other vocalists do.
You kind of hinted on this a second ago, about how Lady Gaga may influence Future. What do you think? Just kind of generally, where do you think like
Yeah.
the standards or jazz music is heading in the near future?
I'm worried about it.
Well,
I actually am like that's my honest take on it at this moment in time. And this is why I've watched it for a long time. Um, and I think that again, I came into my adulthood where there was a resurgence of the standards, right?
yes,
Like people
yeah.
were
Right.
all over it again for a while.
Well, swing
And
dancing
so
was really
we
popular.
kind of
Mm-hmm.
oh my gosh, like we used to go swing
Yeah.
like that's what we did, guys. Like I mean, this was a real thing. It was a wonderful time to be young. No.
Yeah.
But I say this that I think that I naively thought that that was just going to kind of continue and there'd be a bunch of new artists that continued to evolve. And I think that like you have someone like Diana Krall. I remember seeing at one point she was doing like she was doing these massive gigs, and then at some point I knew she was doing a run on like cruise ships,
Mm.
and I was like, she's like the main vocal lady. What is happening here that you're even thinking of booking these types of gigs? And they're gigs and their work, and I'm sure they were paying her well. But the point is that that was alarming to me.
Mm-hmm.
That was a number of years ago, so maybe that was the bad economic times. I don't know, but it happened. And at that time, I remember kind of thinking too, where we had Michael Bublé, who
Mm-hmm.
was the only young guy that really came
Yeah.
out. And we're talking from, let's just give the ballpark of 2000.
Yep.
Michael Bublé, 2000. Who else is there? There
Nobody.
is
Yeah.
nobody.
Yep. Well, he.
And then what about the women?
Yeah.
There's nobody that's a female, what I call a female crooner, or appropriately
Mhm.
you'd say like a songbird,
Yep.
right? There has never been anybody. You could say there's a Diana Krall who's a great jazz vocalist. You could say that Jane Monheit, she's a very nice woman. I do have to say that. Like I met her very casually over this past year and saw her perform live in a very small venue. She is a very nice woman, very, very talented. And I just remember kind of thinking again, oh, like why is it you're 40 something now yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So who is there like you, that's maybe 20? I would take somebody who's even 30 doing that.
Yeah.
And here's the sad part, there are vocalists that are doing things. If you pop on any streaming source, you can find them. But this is what I think the problem is, and this is why I'm concerned about the genre as a whole. I feel like the artists today are, let's say they're Michael Bublé light. So they're kind of mimicky, they're copycatish, they sound good, they look good, but they don't have something that when you hear them, you say that's so and so. Like
Mm-hmm.
their voice does not set them apart. I think that the same is true for female vocalists. I think that there have been some wonderful younger jazz vocalists that have put beautiful albums out, but like they sound kind of like it could be almost anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And so people are like, why am I going to listen to, um, Dinah Washington Light
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
when I could listen to the real deal and just stream it?
Yep.
And I think that that's a problem. And I think that the second part of that problem is that people don't compose like they used to. So you have the standards, and then there's not a real expansion of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're not writing stuff that sounds like it should be in the real books, or in the song books, but you know, I think that that's part of the problem too. Like you can't put Bublé's original
Right.
songs in there.
No.
Right.
Jane Monheit has written originals. They're not going to go into those books. They're good enough to go on their albums,
Right.
but they're not going to become a part of the literature. And I do think that that's part of the problem. I think that we don't have songwriters that are writing like that. And I think that that also hurts the
Yeah.
genre. So copycats and songwriters that aren't able to create new standards, let's
No,
say.
agreed. And
Mhm.
those I totally lost my thought. Those originals, Wow, it was a good one too. It really was. But I guess something to the effect that those originals really don't they don't stand out in any way. They don't. They're not. They're not the reason I buy the album.
Correct.
That's what I was going to say. They're not the reason I buy the
Right.
album.
They're the add-on.
Right. I'm like, oh, that's a nice song. Maybe they play the single on, a light mix radio station because it's a new song, but it
Right.
doesn't last very long. I'm buying that album because it's a jazz album and it's got standards and it's a name that I may recognize. And then what happens to Bublé? He gets now the running joke. He gets put in the closet until Christmas comes around, and everybody dusts off his
Right.
Christmas album, and then he goes back into his closet until the next season. That's
When
not
I
how we
was
should be treating those.
teaching, and when I was teaching, I appreciate you saying that because that's another problem. I remember when I first started teaching, so you're talking even before I was in Florida, but when I was teaching high school in Connecticut, um, I remember I had students that would say to me when they heard jazz, they would say, "Oh, it sounds like Christmas music."
Mhm.
And I was like, "Yikes."
Yeah.
You know? Because again, it was and so at that point in time there was like we were already in a bit of trouble, but then there was a bit of a resurgence. Because also you guys might forget this, but during that time you also had Josh Groban first coming on the scene.
Yep.
So there were a lot of these guys that are now
Copy
like older. Like, I mean, seriously, like these guys are 40s soon to, they're going to be in their 50s before you know it. Like, that's not young. Let's be real about it. And, who's coming next?
You're right.
So I think that, I don't know. Like, I wish I could say that, okay, if we can identify what we think the problem is, well, what's the solution?
Yeah.
I really am not sure that I know what the solution would be, and I don't think anybody does. We obviously haven't figured it out yet. But I will say this because I have heard a couple musicians that I've seen live, and in the moment of their performance, I would get so lost in the song because of the melody, their timbre, their phrasing, the arrangement, where it is a song because it's the standards that I would have heard a million times, but it took me a long time to recognize it because they were so emotionally attached to it. It wasn't that they took it so far out of the park with their interpretation. It was that their emotional interpretation was so deeply different. And I've appreciated that. That's happened a handful of times. And I talked to my husband about it. I'm like, oh my gosh, it took me so long to realize, what the song was. But I say that artist, holy smokes, like they really just did something special. Like to make, to make you say, like, what is this magic you just created?
Mhm.
And it's something you heard 100
Yeah.
times. So I think that maybe to save that genre, maybe that's what we need.
Mhm.
Somebody to connect to it, maybe at that depth, and be able to connect with their audience deep enough, to share that new emotional interpretation.
Right.
And I don't know. I mean, you can't teach that, can you?
Well, it's a multifaceted problem. I
Yeah.
think I would even add to everything we've said things like the coffee house generation
Mhm.
of jazz music has really
Yeah.
belittled what the term
Yeah,
jazz
it puts it in a
means.
box.
Yeah,
Yeah.
to most people who are unfamiliar.
Mhm.
I think also
Although a good coffee shop playlist.
I'm not saying I
is my
dislike
jam.
that music. I'm just saying to an outsider, that's your
Right,
definition
right,
of jazz,
right.
and that's
And
Nora
it's-
Jones does not represent jazz music to
No,
me.
it represents Starbucks.
Yeah, it's Starbucks.
Right. Right.
I also think that there are artists out there who I believe could bring the genre back in the like Leslie Odom Jr., especially now coming off
Yep.
like Hamilton fame. I think that guy's an incredible
Yeah.
vocalist. I think his
Yep.
voice would do standards
Yeah.
incredibly.
Yeah.
And reintroduce that music to a new generation. But I also understand, hey, if he doesn't want to make that music, you know what I mean? Like, I get that. But there are people out there who I think can do it. And again, I think education is just so incredibly important when it comes to these things. Music is itself something that applies and appeals to all of us. But I do think, the more educated you are on it, the more you can appreciate and understand, and your just, your love for it extends beyond genre boundaries. Before we close out, if you had like anything to say to a young like musician student, what would you tell them?
I would say probably the most valuable advice I would give would be that if you're a vocalist, listen to instrumentalists. And if you're an instrumentalist, listen to vocalists. And I think that, I think we naturally gravitate to listen to, like, I'm a singer, I'm going to listen to a singer, right? And I think that that's valuable, but I think that you don't come in, but I think that that's why we get into this copycat stuff.
Mhm.
I think that if you're a vocalist and you listen to an instrumentalist, you have to find your voice.
Mhm.
And I think that if you are an instrumentalist and you listen to a vocalist, you have to find your tone and your phrasing in a way that is not mimicky,
Mhm.
right? I think that that is maybe a bridge to development that isn't stressed enough. And
That's good.
I think that might be the bridge that as you're developing students, like push them to the next step, right? Like after they
Mhm.
start to find their voice because they like certain singers and they realize I can sound like that, get them off of that and figure out, what their voice is without mimicking. And the best way is to kind of flip it, vocal
Oh,
instrumental.
that's great. Well, it becomes a partnership
Mm-hmm.
as well.
I worked with I worked with a quartet in Northern Virginia, and we used to talk about that a lot, that like they were such a nice group of guys, talented guys. And they would talk about that they felt that they grew so much from listening to the great vocalists, the great jazz vocalists. And I would always laugh because I'm like, I can totally relate, because I feel like I learned so much from listening to, the great
Mhm.
trumpet players. And I did, because you realized, you listen to it differently. And I thought it was cool that we were able to develop in a similar way, even though we were never told. We just kind of stumbled upon it. And so that I think is valuable. I mean, everybody is told, listen to as much as you can, diversify. And that is valuable. But I think that sometimes if that's all you're doing is listening, you're missing that piece to bridge you into personal interpretation.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. I
Hmm.
remember being a performer. I was playing in the orchestra for an opera, and I had like one bass drum note. And the maestro told me, "This is the single most important note you'll ever play your entire life." And I thought at the time that was just hyperbole,
Mhm.
and it probably was.
Maybe.
But the reason why was because what was happening on stage, whether I could see it or not, what was happening vocally, that one note just enhanced everything else that was going on.
Yeah.
It was a solo moment. I was the only instrument playing. There was no vocal. It was right in between, like real thematic moment, and it was just something to me that I think kind of hit home in this example. I got chewed out for not taking this moment seriously because it was a quarter note on a
Mhm.
bass drum, because I didn't understand how it enhanced the entire thing,
Mhm.
how it helped.
Yeah.
So I think that's wonderful advice. If you're a music student listening at home, like, yes, absolutely, try things that are unfamiliar, but also try things that are kind
Yeah.
of the opposite of what you do. If you only sing, and then listen to trumpet players. And if you're a trumpet player, well, then listen to some vocal music and some choral things. That's excellent advice.
Yep.
I don't know if you guys have ever kind of dug into this or not, but there are a lot of if you really kind of dig into jazz musicians, a lot of them are so versatile that they may be like, you look at somebody like Dave Brubeck, right? Amazing composer, amazing pianist, and yet he was writing stunning choral music. Like when I say stunning, I mean just absolutely gorgeous. And so sometimes, gosh, like if you're talented in that way, that's another reason to stretch, because you don't put yourself in that box, right? You may have a gift that just needs opening. And if you put yourself in a box and you haven't exposed yourself and you haven't pushed yourself to try new things, the whole world can be missing out on, more beautiful creations that you should be sharing.
Right.
I think that is a perfect note to end on. Hey, pun intended.
Yes.
We normally give everyone the opportunity to pitch whatever they have going on, social media, whatever they want. So this is your opportunity. You know, if you want followers on Instagram, we have a solid 17 people that listen to the podcast. So
and gradually getting fewer and fewer, might I add. So
gradually getting fewer and fewer.
It
No,
might be 5
I
by
think
the time we
that
get to yours.
5. Hey, you know, you do what you got to do. I actually am. I have nothing to pitch.
Great.
Well, we have.
I just hope that whoever needs to hear it, I hope that they stumble upon about what you guys are doing here. And I think that I'm sure whoever hears it will need to, and it will cause them to grow. And that's the
cause
point.
them to listen to jazz music and fall in love.
Yes,
That's the hope.
the next person might be out there, right?
Yeah,
like they may be
that's
like,
true.
I need to
This
look.
gives maybe Fantastic People will give them the kick they need to jumpstart their
Right.
jazz
They
career.
will be so inspired, right?
Yeah.
Well, we appreciate you hanging out with us, and it was a
thanks so
great
much.
talk.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Excellent. Thank you for having me. It was really fun.
Thank you for listening to Fantastic People. Please rate and subscribe wherever you find your podcast, and follow us on social media. That's at Fantastic People Pod on Facebook, at Fantastic_People Pod on Instagram, and at Fantastic People, no E, on Twitter. We'd like to say thank you to Alex Edmondson for our artwork and Charlie Hadley for our intro music. We hope to see you guys next time. Thanks for listening.